must be 8 o'clock because it's time for another live. Thank you so much for joining in, as always, because I love doing these lives. I love talking to you about whiskey and discovering a few things along the way. So this is really exciting for me. Welcome back. Welcome back to the SMWS live stream. I'm your host, Matt Bailey, the National Ambassador for the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. You know what? I'm going to be completely honest with you. We've had a great influx of new members this month already, and it's only the 13th today. And it's been really encouraging to see so many people wanting to start their whiskey journey in 2020 with the Society. It's been a really good month so far, and I'm really excited by what's coming up in the next few months, both through events and bottlings, as I always say. But we're always trying to work on new things to do, and sometimes we... Sometimes I start arranging things in terms of the event side of things, the experience side of things for our members that I have these grand ideas for, and then I put them out and I put them up on the website, and then I go, all right, how am I going to do this? It's almost like proof of concept kind of style of setting up events for members. But I find that really exciting because it's a way for me to test my boundaries as well as our members' boundaries of what a whiskey event can be. And we've been doing this now for 37 years. We've been doing whiskey events in some capacity for that long. In Australia, we've been doing it for 18 years this year, which, look, I'm not the subject tonight, I'm getting off the topic already, but just to put some context into that, we've been doing whiskey events with the Society and members in Australia now for 18 years. 4 of which I've been doing them, but 18 years all up, which Andrew will be able to talk about this better than I can, but just some context of what the whiskey scene looked like in Australia in 2002. It really wasn't that long ago, 2002, but it also was. And even 10 years ago, it was a different scene, but nearly 20 years ago, it was a remarkably different scene, and it's kind of like it's exploded since. And what a whiskey event looked like then, was like single malt appreciation even in 2002 wasn't even really a thing. There was single malts in Australia, of course, but the appreciation of such and there wasn't the explosion of whiskey clubs and widespread conversation and appeal around the malts wasn't such a thing. So if I could go back in time, I'd go back 20 years and start collecting some of the single malts then, and I don't know. Anyway, I'm getting off tangent. I want to say hello to everyone who's joined in. Nick Huzek, Kirsty, 45 Finn, Whiskey Saurus, Scotty, Dram, SM Yan, Matt Music MW. Scotty, you're going to be interested in this actually because I'm talking about something which you've touched on actually in one of your streams. Rob Akers, Mount Boy, Toondegier, Jamie Poos, 1985. Jamie Poos, I'm still convinced that you joined just so you can hear me say the word poos on stream. Well, I've said it, and I say it most nights that you're here, so welcome back. I've got a few bottles in front of me, some of which are Society bottles, some aren't, as you'll be able to see from the camera. Because there's a bit of a discussion tonight, a bit of a Monday rant, which is the theme of Mondays normally. I don't have a rant every week. If I did, I'd be a pretty unhappy person. I'd be constantly ranting and raving about something on Mondays. I'm genuinely quite an upbeat person. I don't have that many rants to go on. But Monday rant, a little bit of a minor rant tonight. And I've got a glass and I'm going to pour myself a whiskey so I can have something to dram on whilst I'm talking about it. As you know, we don't do reviews as such on this channel because the reviews have already all been done, as I say. You just got to read the tasting notes. Pop the cap in that. I am having another dram of 123.30. 123.30. You know what? One of my favourite single distilleries in single cask form. I'll be completely honest with you. I'm not a huge fan of that distillery in general. I'm not a huge fan of their core range, generally speaking, until you've really got to start sort of spending big bucks on some of their higher age statements before it really gets good. That from this distillery. But when you get a first fill, absolutely juicy cask like this, there's so much love in it. There's so much vibrancy. And I was talking to Lockie Watt from Whiskey and Almond, who said he loves these 1, 2, 3 first fills, and he tries a lot of whiskey behind the bar there. He'd be trying more whiskies in a year, I think, than I would be, and that's saying something. And a lot. I think the whole team would be. And they just the amount of he loves these vibrant 1, 2, 3s, and they're just sort of, when they pop up, they're sort of underrated gems, I say. It's a Highland whiskey distillery that matures the stocks in the lowlands, so you can decide whether it's a Highland or a lowland distillery. We classify it as a Highland because it's distilled in the Highlands. Can't wait for 1, 2, 3 to 4, 5. Yeah, Rob, me too. I can't. You know what? I'm still kicking myself that I obviously it was before my time, but I would have loved to have had a cask of 66.6. Or I did actually see triple 1.1 go at auction a couple of years ago now. I was going to say a few months, a couple of years, I think. And things like that. I like that idea. Or maybe one day, maybe a 54.31. I think we're well past that. I think it's like a 54.81 these days. I can't remember what the numbering's up to on all of them. So here we go. Or did I mean to say? Yeah, sorry. 43.21. Anyway. So let's. Okay, what I want to go on what my Monday rant is tonight is talking about how Andrew Durbridge, our cellar master, wrote this fantastic article that really resonated with me and lots of other people who read it. It was talking about, is there too much information in Scotch whisky? And I want to focus on one aspect of that. His argument was saying that there is perhaps too much information being transmitted either via video or on the label or in an outturn, or just in general, like in not just the society, but in the whiskey world. It's like, this whiskey was distilled 11.35 miles from this coastline, and the barley was sourced 23 miles from this coastline, and sat on this rack, on this cask, in this shelf, in this warehouse kind of thing. It's like, what does that tell you about the taste of the whiskey? It tells you absolutely squat. It tells you nothing. And that's what I sort of wanted to touch on tonight, was talking about how the more we know about the information of that whiskey, the less we kind of know about it. The less not less we know about it, but the less it tells us. It doesn't really tell us anything about what it is. And the one aspect of that I'm going to drill down on for my little rant tonight was talking about how is just sort of discussing how certain what's the wording for it? Yeah, things like when you see these things like Scottish barley releases, or you see things that are, say, paddock to bottle or grain to glass, as some of them like to use. So I've seen some distilleries use paddock to bottle as a phrase. I've seen some use grain to glass, as in like from the grain to the glass. It's like it's all one process or something. And then there's some distilleries that proudly are buying, from all sorts of nations to have it made in terms of ingredients and supply. That's what I also want to touch on now, and how much of that is important, and how much does that change the taste of the whiskey. So I was reminded of a Japanese whiskey called Togashi. I don't want to get it right. I think it was Togashi. If anyone wants to pull me up on this, there was like a 12 and an 18, and it came in these sort of squat, sort of opaque bottles. So the Togashi was a blended whiskey. And I think it was one of those sort of Japanese whiskies that has Scotch whiskey in it. But I think it actually had Canadian whiskey in it as well. So I think it had like Canadian whiskey, Japanese whiskey, this much, and Scotch whiskey in the blend. And it used barley sourced from Northern Europe, and it was blended and bottled in Japan, I think, but it may have been blended and bottled somewhere else, to be honest. The rules around how Japanese whiskey is made and produced are very relaxed still. There's a lot of calls for that to change, of course, but hasn't changed yet. Yeah, Industry 4.0 hype, yes. Yeah, and so Monarch Perth, good to see you, Monarch Perth. Thank you so much for joining in. So what my point is here, how important is grain to glass or paddock to bottle kind of whiskey? That Togashi whiskey was nice. It was actually fairly inoffensive, and no, I'm just kidding. It was quite boring, but there was a lot of sort of like discussion around how important it is to get the barley from this farm that's right next to the distillery, and the water supplies from the local spey, and the casks were coopered at the local cooperage. And I wonder, yes, you know what? That's all very romantic, and it's lovely having all those kind of like farmyard distillery kind of operation running. And a lot of the distilleries that we bottle from at the society are very much farmyard kind of distilleries, and where a lot of the production is made and created within sort of 3 miles of the distillery, and that's kind of cool. But does it change the flavour of the whiskey? Now, some would argue yes, like having that freshness of ingredients or something like that, which is irrelevant. But like having that sort of like not irrelevant, sorry, but like not is that going to affect the end result? If that's what's going into the spirit, the end result of what comes out the other end. We've talked about cask versus spirit influence on here before. Sorry, I've got some noisy magpies outside. I've talked about cask versus spirit influence on here before. This is more sort of about how much of those changes is just going to end up being a dearer product at the end rather than a better product, or vice versa. So that's the one which sort of really makes you start to think about what the importance of grain to glass or paddock to bottle kind of is. So I've got some examples in front of me here. Now I want to start with some examples here. Japanese whiskey is a prime example of a whiskey where almost none, I'm going to say almost none, I'll confidently say none of the barley that is used for most Japanese whiskey, that might be a better way to phrase it, comes from Japan. It all comes from Northern Europe, it all comes from other places, it's all imported into Japan, either from Scotland or not really from Scotland, but from Northern Europe, and sometimes even from Russia, I believe, that some malted barley does come from Russia. I'd have to double check that. I don't know the full global... It's a very noisy bird, sorry. I don't know if Mike's catching that, sorry. But I don't know I don't know the full global economics of where barley comes from and where it ends up. But I do know that none of it comes from Japan. Like, there's no barley fields in Japan. So when you see a Japanese whiskey, and I pulled out a Ichiro's Malt Chichibu, Japanese single malt whiskey on the way. Lovely whiskey. I've had this before. I'll have it again. I've got a bottle here. This is something where you go, well, how important is paddock to bottle when it's not at all? In this case, it's imported barley from a totally different side of the world. And so I'm sure some of the barley even comes from Australia. We produce a lot of barley in Australia. So it makes me wonder, this one was bottled 2015. I think it was distilled in 2011. Nope, 2009. So it's a 6-year-old. But yeah, that's this kind of makes you go, like, what's the balance of, what's the importance of having paddock to bottle as an example. So I'm going to pop that over there because there's one example I want to show you. We have bottled a few Japanese whiskies at the Society, including this lovely one, G13.1. It was the first ever from G13. It was a grain whiskey from Japan, a single cask grain whiskey. Dearly departed, that one, but I still have one kicking around, which is very nice. And then there's examples, like I'm going to use Archie Rose as an example. This one says product of Sydney. It's an Australian rye malt whiskey. I almost said single malt. It is not a single malt. It's a rye malt. And has a mash bill of rye malt and pale malt. And I know that if you can go on their website and find where they get their barley from. It's very open door policy with their information. But it says here on the bottle, our preference for malted rye over the far more commonly used unmalted rye affords this whiskey a point of distinction, etc., etc. Nope, it didn't tell me there. Sorry, I was looking for something else. But anyway, I know that the Archie Rose source a lot of their grain from Australia. The exact farm name escapes me at this very moment. But that's an example of where a whiskey is mostly being produced with local barley. I'm sure they've got some New Zealand barley as well, which is very common. So, but my point is, my question is asking, what's the importance? What's the importance over having local barley, or local production, local water, all that kind of stuff? I'm reminded of Amrut Distillery in India, where they get their water from the Himalayas. They have to go, the water to produce that whiskey is being tanked in from thousands of kilometers north. And so it's like not even local water supply there in that case. So that's imported barley, imported water, and imported casks. It's still Indian whiskey. And by the way, some of it's very good. So it's kind of like, my question is, if the end product is good, where's the importance in marketing it, in marketing other product as paddock to bottle, and does it change the whiskey? I don't believe it does. I believe it adds a different spin to it. It adds a different story. It adds a kind of a nice story about being a local farmyard distillery that produces from all within their means. I think that's a cool story. I don't think that... I've also got a yappy dog next door. So again, it's a bit noisy here tonight. And I just don't know how much that improves whiskey, detracts from it, or what that does. I'd love to hear your comments on this. If anyone wants to tune in here, I'd love to hear what you think of the importance over having local barley or local supply or paddock to bottle sort of scenarios, and how is that important? Does that make a difference in the spirit? I don't think it does. So I'm using this example, this 123.30, a cheeky little number from the Sweet, Fruity and Mellow profile. This distillery does not, they actually don't, it's all unmalted spirit from this distillery, but unpeated, scrap that, unpeated spirit. They are one of the only distilleries I know that don't use any peat in the production of their whiskey. However, does this mean that because they buy in barley, because it's Highland and Lowland, does that mean that it's lesser than other whiskies? I would argue completely not. Why would it be? It doesn't change anything. Let me grab some of these comments coming in here. Whiskey Stents. Tim says, but does the strain or type of barley affect the flavour? Yes, and absolutely yes. In fact, I've said before, I think, when it comes to the three main ingredients, barley, water, and yeast, I would personally argue, and I've had one distiller agree with me on this and one distiller not agree with me on this, that barley is the most important factor of the spirit journey. It's in the creation of that spirit. What barley is used, the yield of that barley, the flavour of that barley, whether you're using multiple barley types, in which most cases a lot of them are, to create a richer, rounder, more homogenized spirit type, or you're using a single barley varietal, which will give a much more focused spirit type, but might be not suitable for maturation. So many different things here play a factor in barley. Yeast would be the second most important, very closely followed by yeast, and then very closely followed by water. But I'd say that the water source is the least important of the three ingredients, and I'm outspoken on that a little bit by some, but I'm agreed with on others on that. Very much opinion on that though. The barley strain that they use, which is why like whiskies of yesteryear do taste different a lot of the time from whiskies of today. They're using much higher yield but slightly lower barley varietals these days. Whereas in the old days of whiskey production, a lot of Golden Promise was used, a lot of Chariot, a lot of sort of lower yield, higher flavour sort of barley varietals that are probably harder to farm and harder to work with these days. So yes, very good question. At most, it's an intellectual curiosity, like Laddie Isla Malt, but I can't think of one case where local guaranteed better. SMWS, that's exactly kind of my point here, of saying that it's intellectual curiosity. It's like, oh, okay, well, knowing where the barley comes from, if it came from the farm next door to where the distillery is being made, yeah, that's kind of cool. Does that change does that make it a better whiskey? Arguably not. We're sort of venturing into, does terroir exist? The taste of the land from where that spirit is made. I've heard some absolute whiskey experts say no, in whiskey terroir is not a thing, and I've heard other whiskey experts in the trade say that terroir is hugely important. Of course, if you were to ask a distillery like Bruichladdich or Kilchoman, they might say that terroir is a huge part of their integration, their creation of their spirit and their end result. And if you ask a distillery like Elsa Bay, or you ask a distillery I'll just use Elsa Bay as an example, terroir is probably not even a word they'd ever use ever in that scenario. Does that make it a lesser or better spirit? No, it just makes it a very different spirit and their different approach to it. Monarch Perth says, it's good for local growers and the authenticity of the whiskey coming from a specific area maybe. Authenticity, yes. It's great for local growers, of course. But then again, if they're buying barley from international growers, it's good for them as well. It's good for everyone, really. It's the end result is what's going to be in your glass, of course. But I'm not arguing the fact that the economics of buying locally are probably better for you. I'm saying, well, they're probably better for the entire economy of where you live. It's if you produce whiskey in Australia or Scotland or wherever it is. I'm arguing that the difference in quality output and the story, it's more about the story and the marketing rather than the actual output. Whiskey Saurus, thank you. Whiskey Uncovered, John, good to see you, Whisker. People like provenance stories, and I think as an effect of more demand of transparency, but agree with SMWS that it's about selling a story. And I've got nothing wrong with selling a story. I'm selling you a story right now. We're having a bit of fun talking about this. And this is a kind of story about discussion about why I love this kind of thing and why I love this discussion, because I could talk about this for 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes or something. I've only done 20 so far. It's okay. Just checking. And I just, it's like I wouldn't be able to get even close to this kind of level of detail in just one event, if you came to one of my events that I'd host. Speaking of hosts, good time to do a little announcement. If you saw our story, you've already seen it. If you've seen Outturn, you've already seen it. Formally welcome Alex Moores, our new Victorian manager, who's taking the reins over from Owen Smythe. And Alex and I will be working quite closely together on a number of events throughout Melbourne this year. So if you're based in Victoria and you're thinking about becoming a member, or you've been a member and you've not been to an event in a while, things are changing. It's really exciting, and there's a lot coming, some really exciting formats. And I think we had a great year last year, if I'm saying so myself. The members seem to really enjoy it. We had things like whiskey lunches, whiskey cruises. We had a great year last year, and we've got some more coming this year, of course. And then, of course, anywhere you are in Australia, there's benefits to membership. Less so if you live in Darwin, but you can still access our whiskey. We just don't do too many events there. I'm very sorry. Let me grab some of these other questions. So whiskey is all about the experience for me. I love ordering and listening to the expert explaining about it. Does it change the taste? Who knows? That's exactly right, whiskey, Zach. For me, it's all about the whiskey experience as well. It's about the experience and the story. I love learning about these whiskies as I'm drinking them. Whether that be in great company, whether that be with you on camera now, whatever it is, it's kind of the experience of enjoying these whiskies and experiencing flavour through time and experiencing flavour pairings and the story behind the cask, the story behind the society, how this all came about. That's all really exciting to me. And that's what it is. It's having a great story behind great whiskey. We can't really ask for much more. So yes, does it change the flavour or taste? I don't know. In fact, I don't think anyone will be really able to tell that unless there's distilleries out there that are doing paddock to bottle versions of whiskey and then not paddock to bottle versions of the same whiskey. But even then, casks are all different, as we all know, with single casks being all utterly unique, each one. Benoit asks, is there a way to compare the exact same distillate in two versions? I think that's what I was just sort of saying, Benoit, sorry. Yeah, is there a way to compare this? You could. I'm sure distilleries have done that. I'm sure distilleries have done local barley strains, local barley finished new make spirit, and then non-local barley finished new make spirit. And the difference in the new make is probably quite close, but still enough of a difference that they can tell them probably in a blind taste, especially for a good distiller or a good panel. However, the fact that that's going to go into casks then, and that's the huge variation going on there in the wood, it'd be hard to know which one really, if it's actually affected it over the length of maturation, even if maturation is quite short. On the reverse, how local does something have to be in order to count as from that place? I love this question. Okay, local distilling, local blending, all of it imported with a local label. It's fuzzy. SMWS, here's a good one for you. Let's say it's a local distiller. So the distiller was born here. And let's say the distillery is based in Australia, and they're using only Australian barley, okay, only Australian water, great, Australian yeast being produced here, okay, and then let's say that there's casks. Where are they getting their casks from? Are they ex-bourbon barrels? Now they're American. Okay, you've taken away. Okay, let's say they're wine casks, Australian wine casks. Okay. Yes, so you could do that, and a local bottling line and local distribution of the product. That's very cool. That's kind of how most Australian wineries operate, in that they're using local grapes, and local winemakers, etc. In distilling, it is harder to do something entirely local, and again, I'm just questioning whether the effort, expense, and process changes that, and that's what I'm always wonder about, especially when it comes to the marketing angle, because that's my realm. It's like if I see it being marketed as a paddock to bottle, it's like, well, does that add? If you see something with paddock to bottle written on it, or grain to glass, or whatever the phrasing is, it's like, oh well, that adds $100 to the bottle straight away because it's all local. It's like, yeah, it probably does. I mean, there's probably a lot of expense gone into doing that, but the story is interesting either way. Alex, who Robert Akers says, nice try, Dr. Akers, nice try. Jamie Poos, yeah, I had a great time at Joe Edge listening to the story, and I liked how they use their own water source. Yeah, they do, and that's great. And they're going to be the mercy of their local water, and in quite a dry land that we're in. But by the way, Scotland have the same problems. They often have drought as well, believe it or not. Monarch Perth, for me, it depends on how I'm feeling. If I'm looking for taste, then there are certain whiskies I prefer. But if it's to connect to home, I'll actually compromise taste for the memories in Scotland. You know what? That's quite beautiful. And I'm the same. It's, you know what? I've talked about this once before, and I think I'll do another piece on it really. But comes down to mood. It comes down to what you're in the mood for. Sometimes I'm in the mood for like a 5-6-year-old refill bourbon cask that's zesty, spirit-driven, and lovely, bright whiskey. In fact, in summer, I'll find more of those are appealing. Whereas in winter, I might find myself, in the mood for something else, or maybe on Tuesday night, I'll be in the mood for something else. You know what I mean? Your mood will sort of change along with the dram you're enjoying. They must blow the glass on site too and hand draw the labels. Can't they use an Australian printer for the labels? Yeah, and etch the glass as well. Hand etching on the glass as well. Each bottle number, etc. Yes. Robert, they are blowing something hot air. They are blowing hot air. I'm glad you clarified that, Whiskey Zach. That was almost heading down a dangerous territory. I really appreciate you tuning in for this, because this has been great. For those who've just tuned in, or those who are just coming into the stream now, onto the Instagram live, we've been talking about the difference in paddock to bottle, local release barley sort of releases versus mass releases. Does it affect the flavour? Does terroir exist? Is another way of phrasing it. It's a complicated subject, because there's a lot to consider here. So anyway, and I'm enjoying it, a 123.30, and I'll sort of start it by saying, if you've got a Japanese whiskey where none of the grains come from Japan, is it still a Japanese whiskey? It's not grained to glass? Doesn't matter. Just enjoy it for what it is. I'm totally fine with stories in the lovely narrative, but it's common with the provenance of barrels being so talked about. At the end of the day, whiskey has to be good. Taste it blind, and if it's good, then it's good. If it's not, it doesn't matter where anything came from. Very good point, Alex. Very good point, Mr. Moores. If it tastes good, it tastes good. And that's really what it comes down to. It needs to taste good in the glass, not just about the story behind it. I'm not going to say, actually, you know what? Here's one for you. I went to a tasting, it'd be about three and a half years ago now. I was invited as a member, a guest, a VIP or something, as a media, if you like to call it. I don't know. To go to this launch of this whiskey. Now, I won't say what the brand is. I won't say where it is, because I'm not here to chastise. There was such a narrative placed behind before we were even allowed to taste it. And it was like this launch of this. I don't think the whiskey's even in the market anymore. I think it must have come and gone, and no one really sort of bought it. But there was this huge narrative about the story behind it and everything. But as soon as the caps came off the glasses at the event, everyone sort of looked at each other like, that's not any good. What's going on here? It was a deeply flawed whiskey, and whiskey's a bit of a broad stretch of the use of the word whiskey in this case. But the story, I love a good story, and I love the narrative behind it. But if it's not good in the glass, it's not good in the glass. Some great stories on those Dark Valley bottles. So yeah, I'm fine with the story and the lovely narrative. You know what? But Alex raises a really valid point here. He says, but it's common with the provenance of barrels being so talked about. You know what? I think that's a uniquely Australian problem. And this is Monday Rant, so I'm going to get away with this one. But this is a uniquely Australian problem. You see this all too often, and I've ranted about this before, but too much of the emphasis on local maturation is being put on the history and provenance of the cask rather than the development of the spirit. And that is really, really to their detriment. Distillers talking about, especially new wave distillers, I'm talking distilleries post Lark Overeem, Sullivan's Cove kind of era Australian distilleries, which is there's now 100 more since they've been around. And you sort of say, they're sort of saying about, we've got these casks from this old winery, and they were sitting in the winery for the last 200 years, and they're possibly the world's best wine casks. And I'm like, okay, that's great. You've got some good wood coming, and it's like, if you get it properly coopered and charred or whatever you're going to do with it, and fill it with spirit. That's all that matters, is what's going to come out the other end, not what the cask is. So innovation in good spirit will not. Well, I don't like using the word innovation, but which is a subject for another night. But development of good spirit will change the outcome of that whiskey in the end far more than an exotic cask. In fact, self-plug here, if you go to the smws.com.au/news, there's a great article that we published about a month ago called 5 Things I Wish I Knew Earlier in My Whiskey Journey. And one of those things was how an exotic cask can hide a poor spirit. and that is very, very much the case. Too much focus on cask. Do you think it's... I missed some comments here. Agreed, says SMN. Too often the concept overcomes the outcome. They made it from all the ingredients who produced 100 kilometers. Yeah, but they shouldn't have. Very, very, very good point. That's exactly what I mean. Just because they can doesn't mean you should. SMN, read too much focus on cask. Do you think it's because nobody had figured out how to talk about distillation in a marketing way? Well, yes and no. I think no one knows how to talk about it in a marketing way, and how to sell good spirit yet. Especially locally, if I'm being completely honest. I mean, some distilleries don't put any emphasis on talking about their spirit at all. Some distilleries turn their head distillers into superstars and say their spirit's really good. I think some of them do a balance of both. I think it needs to be happening more of, though, if I'm being honest. At SMN, I don't think it's because it's a marketing thing in this case. I think it's because nobody's really taking the time to properly develop their spirit. You asked the question. I asked the question, and they say, "Oh, yeah, we're just getting the same barley as so and so, and yep, we're just getting brewer's yeast. Yep. How long's your ferment? Oh, 40 hours, whatever. It's like, or 20-hour ferment, whatever it is. It's like quite short often. Some distilleries do long ferments, not very often. Lark do a long one, but there's like you sort of go, well, oh, okay, that's a shame. It's like there's not really you're not really sort of innovating and experimenting. If I could just do one little plug, and I know they're a partner of ours, and we've got a great relationship with them, but I will say Archie Rose have spent a lot of time, money, and effort in innovating spirit. Especially my old friend Dave Withers, spending a lot of time on innovating and working on making great spirit, and even to the point where others have copied him and sort of copied his results. Copying is fine, what do they say? Imitation is the greatest form of flattery. Anyway, but it's kind of like and I think that's great. Just as other independent bottlers have copied the SMWS in our approach. Which has been great, giving sort of releasing independent whiskies with wacky names and things, and that's great. There's no problem with that, because it broadens the paint, widens the paintbrush. The paint stroke gets wider, and everyone has a lot more fun with great whiskey. But in terms of focusing in on distillers, honing in on their spirit, I think that's something that could be really done a lot better of. There you go. There's my English there's my English, good English, lots of. Questions coming in. 100% agree. Some casks that have phenomenal wine don't make good whiskey expressions. Very true. Which is why you don't see too many whiskies matured in like Chateau Yquem casks. There's probably two reasons for that. The Scots are cheap, so they're not going to spend money on those kind of casks. But secondly, most of the Scotch whiskies I've had out of exotic, like Italian or French wine casks, have been a little bit ho-hum and just too inconsistent. Way too inconsistent and way too far out of house style. You know what? Actually, I'm going to talk about this maybe tomorrow night or the night after. It's a bit of a nerdy topic, talking about some of the history of... I've been reading about a certain company pushing up against wanting to actually ever bottle single malts. Fascinating. Doesn't matter what the market wanted. It's the tides were changing and they still didn't want to. Anyway, so they talk casks instead, yeah. Given how many different influences go into a whiskey end product, is it difficult to prove the real influence of individual parts like barley, water, cask? Very, very good question, Tim. Given how many different influences go into a whiskey, look, I can't remember the exact number, but there was some research done by the SWRI, which is the Scotch Whisky Research Institute, about the number of touch points in the production of a whiskey that also make a difference in the end result. And the number was something like 160, 165 touch points along the way. And that was things like, the temperature of the wash, the time of fermentation, the size of the ferment tanks. There's 3, things like that. It's like there were so many touch points along the way. I think they called them touch points or hit points along the way that changed the overall flavor. I would argue that the biggest influences are going to be what goes in to begin with, of course. The strain of barley, of course, the strain of the yeast, the water supply, what creates those core ingredients, and then, of course, the selection of cask, the charring of the cask, the size of the cask, of course, the size and shape of the still, all those kind of bigger factors do change the overall influence of a whiskey. And that's why when distilleries change those things, the flavour of their whiskey changes. When distilleries change even like one still out and they replace it with a new still, and that new still is slightly slimmer or slightly wider or slightly taller or smaller, it changes the entire spirit character. And that does happen. That's why when you see new stills going into Scotch whisky distilleries to replace worn out old copper stills, they are replicas, they are one-for-ones, and it takes weeks and weeks, sometimes I've heard, of distillers running that still and trying to produce what they used to produce and doing benchmarking tests, because consistency is key, and that's why you don't want to change the flavor profile of a whiskey, especially if you've got quite a dynamic, unique flavor profile going on in your spirit character. And you've got an output to maintain, especially if you're supplying blenders. Shape is stills is marketed by some, yes. But I love it when they talk reflux. Reflux, yeah, of course. Or cooling balls, or line arms. When they start, marketing line arms and cooling balls, I think we're all in for trouble. You know what? I think that's really important, though. I think I was just talking about size and shape of the still is quite important, which is why things like Glenmorangie have quite really tall. They have the tallest stills in Scotland. Still, I think, tallest stills still. There you go, in Scotland. I need a dram. Hold on. Otherwise, I'm going to make more crap jokes. Oh, she's a big one. A drop of water, I think, will widen that one right up. Big drop of water. It is quite high. 61.7. Yeah. So yeah, the shape and the size of the still is often marketed by some as as part of their identity, as part of their flavour, and rightly so. I think in some cases stills like the stills at somewhere like Glenlossie, although they don't market it, they don't market anything, but the stills at Glenlossie and stills at Dalmore and places like that are quite unique, quite interesting looking shape and size. Whereas just like Glenmorangie, quite tall and slender, that create a light, quite a light and fluffy floral profile, things like that, quite a sweet profile. No, you don't need to apologise for being late, Cal. We'll be on YouTube later, don't worry, in about an hour. This gets to be a good agree, but it has to be in your glass or in your heart. Can put a different slant on things. Absolutely agree, Monarch Perth. Yeah, Tuesday nerd out. They have a Yakemen cask going at, I think, Glenmurray. Yeah, look, Liam, the Glenmurray have had, I've walked through a few of their warehouses, and they've got heaps and heaps of weird and wacky wine casks, cider brandy casks, Riesling casks, all sorts of strange things going on in there. A lot of it has come down to the fact that they were purchased in 2004, or do I say 2002 or 2004, somewhere around there. The distillery was bought by a French company that I always get the name wrong, but it sounds something like La Martiniquaise, I think, La Martiniquaise, a French company. How do you like my French? It's a French company. It's a French wine company. They've got access to so much good wine casks. They may as well send them. Sounds like Glenmurray, they do weird casks. Yeah, some really work well though. Yeah, but at least they experiment. At least they actually give it a red hot go. It's it's like if you were to compare something like Glenelgan to Glenmurray as two great examples of distilleries. While I love Glenelgan for their big nutty worm tubby spirit, I love Glenmurray for their innovation in casks and interesting flavors and that nuttiness that you get out of a lovely Glenmurray as well. So love the 35s. Big shout out to 35s. And looking forward to seeing what they come up with. You're having enough trouble with English tonight? Leave the French for another time. Thanks, Dr. Akers. Always a good encouragement. Look, you know what? This has been a really bloody awesome stream, and I'm going to hit my time limit if I don't. And YouTube are going to get grumpy. I'm going to have to split it into two, and I don't really want to do that. So I'm going to drop it there. Big stream tonight. Thank you so much. Great first night back. Really good chance to have a chat with you all and answer some questions live here on Instagram. The shout out now goes again to saying that we've got some great events up on the website, especially some 2 events in Sydney coming up and a couple all around Australia, of course, and some more to be announced. Canberra, Perth and Hobart to be announced soon. I've said that a few times, but we're working on a few things. If you want to catch us on the live stream, you can up on the hit the button in your top left corner on Instagram for the next 24 hours. Otherwise, watching our YouTube channel, Scotch Malt Whisky Society Australia. And please subscribe to the channel. Pardon me. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the little bell. We really appreciate you following along and learning as we go. So have a great one. Really appreciate it, Dr. Akers. Thanks, Mortal Official. You just missed us. And Cal, Whiskey Jusmo, Malia Barry, 45 Finn. Everyone who tuned in tonight, I'm not going to name you all, but you know who you are. Really appreciate it, and I'll see you all tomorrow night. Cheers.